Champlain room, microphone test, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, as soon as all of our committee members are seated, we're going to start. Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to, I'm going to call the committee to order and welcome you to the second Build Heritage Subcommittee meeting. And we have just two items today. The first one, we're going to have a presentation from our chief bylaw person, wears a uniform and everything now, Linda Anderson, and then the next item is the application to alter the former Ottawa East Town Hall at 61 Main Street. Do we have anyone here to speak to that? We have no one here to speak to that. Does anyone on the committee want to hold that? This is the ramp that they're going to be putting in with the. I think personally, I think it looks very nice. But does anybody else want to hold it? So is that carried then? And we'll go back and ask you if there's any declarations of interest. We're all interested? Good. And confirmation of minutes? Carried. No one has any comments on that? Good. So we're going to go to our presentation, and Christine Hardig is joining Linda Anderson. Thank you for coming today. And is Sally coming? She is coming, Leslie? Thank you. So the reason we have this item on the agenda today, if you remember about a month ago, I think it was, that the mayor and Councillor Hume were very public about their disdain for the condition of some of the derelict properties in the city of Ottawa. And consequently, a report was being drafted and is being drafted, which will go to the Community and Protective Services Committee. But as we know, in our role as the stewards of heritage in the city, some of these properties have heritage designation. And so we thought that we could contribute to that report by having a discussion on that today and having Ms. Anderson and obviously Ms. Hartig, and here comes Sally. Talk to us today about it, and then hopefully we'll have some input into the report. When is that report due to Community Protective Services?
April 18th.
Okay, good. So thank you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you and good morning. I want to prep all of this by saying I'm not an expert at either the heritage component, and I just have a knowledge of the Building Code Act that may get me into trouble. So unfortunately nobody from Building Services could be here, but we did meet with them on Friday, so I'm hopeful I can answer some of those questions. So thank you for inviting us this morning to come and give a presentation. As Councillor Harder has stated, this is an initiative that has come forward due to the fact that there appears to be a growing issue with vacant properties that are becoming derelict in the city of Ottawa, and a desire to come up with mechanisms to address it. So bylaw services are the keepers of the property standards bylaw, and that's a relatively easy mechanism to use for the exterior of the buildings at the present time. But we're working very closely with Building Code Services, the Heritage Group, and our Legal Services branch, bringing this report forward on the 18th. So what I thought we would do this morning, and I want to thank Ms. Hartig, she's agreed to be my clicker this morning, is just walk through some of the properties that may be of interest to this group in terms of their heritage status. So we need to go back one. Christine.
Sorry, I'm a little sorry. This isn't responding very well, this one. Okay.
All right, that's it. So this is 7880 Bolton Street. It does have a heritage designation, Part 5. The Building Code Services reports that a heritage permit was issued for demolition and new construction in 2009. The site plan control approval extended to December 31st, 2012, but as the proposal did not meet the zoning bylaw, further extensions are denied, and in order to move forward, the owners of this property must return to the Committee of Adjustment. The building has been vacant and boarded up for an undetermined amount of time. So this is a prime example of where we can use our current property standards bylaw to try and address the exterior components of this building and bring it up to standard, minimum standard, as well the board up bylaw, which we'll get into later on in the presentation. 143 Murray Street, once again, Part 5 heritage designation. The most recent activity on this is a pre-planning application consultation, August 14th, 2012. The request is to rezone to permit a restaurant on the ground floor with the continuation of residential use on the second floor. This building also has been vacant for an undetermined amount of time. The most recent complaints we have received in bylaw services are for graffiti and needles on the site. Generally speaking, this property is fairly well maintained. 197-201 Wilbrod. Once again, heritage designation under Part 5. The building is both subject to heritage control and demolition control. The owner did launch a lawsuit against the city, which was settled in July of 2011. There was an order issued by Building Code Services on February 27, 2012 to correct an unsafe building condition. There is a wall that is significantly bowed out. The owner has yet to comply as of March 26, 2013. And my latest information is that Building Code Services is moving forward on that non-compliance. The condition of this building is steadily deteriorated, the west wall a particular concern, given the proximity to the building to the west. The property has been the subject of many graffiti, debris, and board-up complaints. People have frequented the area for drugs and other related activities. 207-209 Murray Street, once again, heritage designation Part 5. There is a pre-planning application consultation for this property in September of 2011 to build a 4-story boutique hotel. The application also includes the neighboring property at 281 and 287 Cumberland Street. Presently, this building and the one 287 Cumberland are in litigation. The building has been vacant and boarded up for an undetermined amount of time. The building did sustain damage as a result of a fire in 2003. The most common issue is that the area is being frequented by drug users, and there's been a significant number of calls for needle hunters pickup there. So it is a congregated area. 260 Murray Street. This is on the Heritage Reference List, Category 3, and this is information that Sally could assist with if you have questions on that. The premises was operated as a licensed rooming house until September of 2005. Complaints have been limited to board-up, needle pickup, graffiti, and debris. And once again, the exterior of this building is ripe for action under the property standards bylaw. The repair of the siding, the porch, the shutters on the windows, the roof over the porch, those are all issues that can be addressed through the property standards bylaw currently. This is a series of buildings on King Edward. They're on the Heritage Reference List. The previous owner of this property received approval of site plan for 2 buildings with 30 units stacked townhouses. Approval granted in February 2001 and site plan control agreement registered in 2002. Securities are held. The premises was operated, as I said, as a rooming house. Complaints are limited to board up, needle pickup, graffiti, and debris. And once again, these are buildings that the property standards and the board up bylaws can easily apply to get the exterior standards up to acceptable level. 287 Cumberland, as most of you know, it's been in the media recently, and it is currently before the courts. A building permit was issued in April of 2001 for the construction of a 10-unit apartment building. The permit is dormant. There are 2 pre-planning application consultations for the property, one in 1997, the second in September of 2011. The 2011 pre-consultation related to rezoning of the property and the adjoining 281 Cumberland, which is also vacant, to allow the construction of a 4-story boutique hotel. The building has been vacant and boarded up since the 1980s. The area is frequented by drug users, significant calls for needle hunters. We're moving into an area where we haven't as yet obtained photographs of the buildings, and we're starting to get into non-heritage, but this, even though Clarence and Gig state that they're heritage, the Clarence one is simply on the list. The one at 179 Gig is heritage designated Part 5. And I'm just going to quickly run through our list of other vacant buildings in the City of Ottawa, which don't necessarily have heritage designation, but are of concern to us during this project. So, Ms. Hartig, if you could just go through. Go ahead. Okay. 1125 Bank Street, I'll just point out, has been of concern. Some of you know it as the former West Coast Video location. Building Code Services is satisfied with the structural integrity of the building. Given that, we will move forward with property standards issues on the exterior of that building. So, to date, we have amassed a list of approximately 40 properties in the City of Ottawa that are vacant, some of which are, in fact, heritage, and we will be moving forward quite quickly on these issues. In fact, we have 8 orders prepared, being reviewed by legal. We're hopeful that those orders will be ready for service today or tomorrow. So, just to give you a bit of a background, the recent events in the city related to vacant properties have brought to the forefront the importance of property owners taking responsibility to maintain their lands and the buildings in good condition. Lands and buildings which are left vacant and in disrepair pose potential public safety issues and can make our communities and neighborhoods unsightly and unpleasant places in which to live. They may even devalue the surrounding properties. The city takes these issues very seriously and is implementing a strategy to address them using regulatory mechanisms as well as seeking to implement new mechanisms. So I'll just quickly run through the existing mechanisms that we have. So as I've mentioned numerous times, we have a property standards bylaw in the City of Ottawa and a property maintenance bylaw related to the lands surrounding the buildings. So the property standards bylaw does require that buildings, both exterior and interior, and lands be maintained to a minimum standard and ensure safety. Such examples are making sure that the roof is in good repair, that any painted surfaces are maintained and painted, that the components of the building, such as the foundations and the porches, are sound. Keeping in mind that any of the property standards orders with respect to any of the buildings which have heritage component will reference the potential to make application under the Ontario Heritage Act. Our City of Ottawa board-up bylaw requires that vacant buildings be rendered inaccessible and be able to withstand the elements. A further component of that bylaw states that the materials that are used for boarding up must coordinate with other finishes on the exterior. And as you saw in the previous slides, many of the existing boarded up buildings are not complying with our board up bylaw. As well, the City of Ottawa has a graffiti management bylaw that requires owners to keep their properties free of graffiti. During the summer months, we have 2 officers dedicated full-time to proactively issuing orders under our graffiti management bylaw. As well, we've started enforcing stringently our signs bylaw. You might notice around some of the vacant buildings that they put up boarding or hoarding around it, and on that hoarding there are numerous postering signs. That is not permitted under the signs bylaw, and so we have started to pursue that issue as well to make sure that those signs, those posters, are removed. So what we're proposing, what we will be putting forward as our proposals on the 18th of April is some potential new mechanisms to address these issues. Currently, owners of vacant properties may apply to the province to reduce the rate at which their properties are taxed. The City of Ottawa is proposing to make a proposal to make a request to the provincial government that would grant the city the authority to limit the property tax reduction on vacant properties. As well, we're considering, the City of Winnipeg has a model wherein they require any owners of vacant properties to obtain permits on an annual basis in order to leave their buildings vacant. And those permits, the fees collected for them, are used for the additional enforcement that has to happen at vacant properties. As you've noticed before, we spoke of graffiti, needles, vagrants, homeless people gaining access into the building. So there are additional resources that are frequently required at vacant buildings. As well, we're proposing some amendments to the property standards bylaw to strengthen the provisions in the existing bylaw and to require higher standards of maintenance of vacant lands and buildings to prevent the deterioration. It is our proposal on the 18th that we develop specific standards pursuant to the Ontario Heritage Act for the maintenance and repair of heritage buildings. As well, we're intending to amend the bylaw so that the components of the bylaw related to vacant buildings are taken out and they're put into one section specifically. Fire safety plans for commercial buildings. On vacant commercial buildings, it is required that fire safety plans be in place and that safety systems be maintained. So that would be something else that we'd be pursuing. As I stated earlier, the strategy moving forward is to be presented to Community and Protective Services Committee on April 18th for approval. Thank you, and we're open for questions.
Actually, thank you for your assistance, but actually the first person that I saw was Member Smollett, so thank you. Go ahead.
From what I can see, it seems to be a two-pronged approach. You have some new initiatives that you're proposing, and then to give you some new powers. And then there's also dealing with what powers you already have. And that's to where I'd like to direct my question. You mentioned that there are many existing buildings which currently do not comply with the existing powers you have. And I guess if you could remind me, just why is it that we're at that, why has that developed now that there's so many buildings, especially ones that you illustrated in your photographs there, that would appear to be clearly deficient and have been for many, many years? Why has that situation arisen like this? Thank you.
This this issue was the policy, the procedure in the former city of Ottawa, where many of these buildings are located, that if a vacant building was properly boarded up, that was sufficient. The lack of resourcing, for the most part, prevented them from taking proactive measures against the buildings. As we've moved forward through this process, it's become clear to us that we certainly do have the power to do this. We now have the resources, and that's why we're pursuing it at this time.
Just one follow-up. Can you give me, of the issues that you've illustrated to us, do you have any idea what percentage you can actually deal with the current powers that you have now that you have the resources? And how many will only be able to be dealt with these new powers that you're seeking?
Certainly on the exterior of the buildings, 100%. We have standards for exteriors of buildings, and we can pursue that. What we're proposing in terms of heritage buildings and amendments to say might be something like the City of London, wherein they require that if a heritage building is to be left vacant, the heating system must stay on inside that building. We do not currently have those provisions in our bylaw. It is something that we would like to take forward and pursue if council is willing.
Good morning. Thanks for your presentation. I have a couple of questions about the existing property standards bylaw as it is today. Does this bylaw cover every type of building use? In other words, does it cover all commercial uses, all institutional uses, all industrial uses? Does it cover buildings that are owned by, say, the municipality of Ottawa, or school boards, or the federal government, or the province? So does the bylaw cover all of these conditions?
Yes, the bylaw covers all types of buildings. Some of the examples you gave get into authority of the municipality. However, the standards that are established in our bylaw are meant to apply to all buildings in the City of Ottawa. Moving forward on enforcement of those standards is where we may get into issues of authority vis-a-vis the federal government, those kinds of issues. But given how we're about to pursue this, we don't dismiss those buildings simply because they aren't privately held or they're not residential. We will move forward methodically with all of the buildings.
Two follow-up questions, if I might. There are some pretty glaring cases of buildings which are maybe on the heritage reference list, but are not necessarily identified in a Part 5 or Part 4 designation. And I'm thinking of a particular building which may not actually have been on the bylaw standards list, and I'm thinking in particular of the Booth board mill. Now, the Booth board mill probably creates a kind of puzzle in most people's minds because you don't know which country it's in or which planet it's on. But it is an enormous building of heritage interest on Chaudière Island in the City of Ottawa, next to Victoria Island, and it has now been vacant and deteriorating for over 40 years. It's owned by Domtar, and it is a building built in 1904, so it has, if it has not been designated by the City of Ottawa, it certainly has merit in visiting. But I've visited that building. I've done a number of studies on it for the National Capital Commission over the years, and it has been slowly deteriorating, but is a major part of our industrial heritage in the City of Ottawa. And I would like to know that the property standards bylaw will enable the city to inspect and to recommend action for this building. Now, that's a building that is not an example of the tiny little houses that we have seen, but is much more significant in the identity and history of Ottawa that has been certainly overlooked. So my question is, does the existing bylaw actually cover this building? And I won't ask why we haven't done anything. I know it's a question of resources and priorities, but that's the second question that I have.
Interesting, Mr. Podolsky, that you raised this one, because we discussed it on Friday afternoon. This would be an issue that I would have to address with legal services. Some of the buildings, the ownership in Councillor Clark's ward, there's a building that's owned by an embassy, for instance. If legal services says we can move forward, then we will move forward. But on some of the properties, the ownership is not straightforward, shall I say. So we will be coordinating very closely with legal services. Hopefully we can address the issue of that building, but we will need to make sure that we're on very solid ground legally before we do so.
Just one more follow-up on this, because I think that with the bylaw amendments coming forward on the 18th, I think it's probably desirable to have it effective, and that we don't have to come back for another round of amendments. But that's an example that I think it's certainly within the City of Ottawa. It is of heritage interest. I'm not sure if Sally can tell us whether it's on the heritage reference list or not. I think it is. But there's a candidate building that, regardless of whether or not the ownership is clear, it's certainly not owned by the city or the federal government. My understanding, it's privately owned, and therefore should be one of those properties that should be qualifying for inspection and application of the standards.
We will definitely have it on the list, and we will certainly, as I said, coordinate with legal services on moving forward on that property.
And Madam Chair, just one final thing, which we're talking about the heritage reference list. Could I request that from City Heritage staff that the members of the committee are given the spreadsheets of the buildings that are on the heritage reference list? I realize that they're out of date, but I think it would be helpful in this discussion to know which ones are actually on the list.
Do you mean the heritage reference list for the entire city, or which ones on Linda's list are also on the heritage reference list?
I think the ones that are given, that are identified under the heritage staff's activities.
Do you only want the heritage reference list as it refers to derelict buildings?
No.
Or do you want the whole heritage reference list? That's my question.
Yeah, the whole heritage reference list.
Okay, we'll look. Again, we don't publish a version because it outdates so quickly, but I can see what I can get for members of the committee.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'm just wondering whether, with the recent acquisition of Domtar by Hydro Ottawa, if Hydro Ottawa is not the owner now of the building.
Madam Chair, I can speak to that. Hydro owns some buildings, and Domtar owns other buildings on the site, and that it's always, and the NCC owns a little bit of land, and the city owns a little bit of land. There are multi-ownerships, but Hydro hasn't acquired anything new recently, and Domtar remains the owner of the former buildings associated with the match and pulp and paper industry.
And the building in question that Vice Chair Podolsky raised, it is within Ottawa's boundaries?
Yes, it's on the Ottawa side of the river.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Councillor Hobbs?
Thanks, Madam Chair. And just in regards to the Vice Chair's question, today, how do you know when, Ms. Anderson, when you're going out for a derelict property call, if it is on the heritage list? What is the process to sort of go through to determine? I know today there may not be higher standards for it, but are you aware of that when you go out? Is there a cross-check?
Through you, Madam Chair, the heritage reference list is on MAP, so any address that anyone in the city, that's our GIS system, so it can be checked by Linda and her staff, plus they often ask us to double check. So it is available without consulting heritage staff or with consulting heritage staff.
Perfect, thank you. And, I know I have 12 or so properties in Kitchissippi that are a problem and vacant, but they're not on the heritage list, so I won't take time to ask about that. But does having a heritage designation on a derelict property help you or hinder you today, or make no difference, and that's why you're seeking more teeth to this situation?
As far as the property standards bylaw, it makes no difference. However, it does make a difference in terms of how the repairs are done, so the potential overlay of heritage. We had a very successful one in Sandy Hill a few years ago, where with the assistance of heritage folks, we were able to repair the building to what it should have been, in the manner in which it should have been repaired. So it makes a difference in terms of heritage. It makes a difference in terms of building code services, in terms of what can be developed there, and what kinds of permits are required. So that's why we're working very closely with the other branches in the city to ensure that that we are cognizant of the overlay of heritage on these buildings.
Okay. So in terms of the, you discussed earlier having minimum standards, and I guess minimum standards are normally what all you can legally apply without going to a different level of approval from the courts, or does that apply in heritage if a minimum standard is just to board it up? Or maybe you could explain what minimum kind of covers.
We only have the authority to apply minimum standards to buildings. Okay. But to give you an example, if a porch is to be repaired on a heritage building, there may be attributes of the woodworking on that porch that need to be maintained. And that is where we would deal with Sally and her heritage planners to ensure that the repairs were done in a way that meets the heritage standard. Okay. So yes, there's a minimum standard of repairs under property standards, but the heritage overlay requires that the works be done in a certain way. Okay. And so that's the other level that we have to take into consideration.
Okay, thanks.
And further to that, Councillor Hobbs, through you, Madam Chair, is that a building that is designated under the Ontario Heritage Act, if it's deemed to be irreparable, and has to be, or if someone believes that it has to be demolished, it still has to go through the process under the Ontario Heritage Act. So if there is a designated building that has fallen into deep disrepair, they can't just go in and once it's been determined that it isn't salvageable, they still have to apply for a demolition permit under the Ontario Heritage Act and receive the permission of City Council under the Ontario Heritage Act. Okay. So that is another, even though it's a property standards issue, it remains a heritage building, it remains a designated heritage building, and a due process has to be followed.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that clarification. And just on the 287 Cumberland Street, they got a permit to, I think, change that to a 10-story building or something in 2001, but that permit is dormant. Does anything change throughout time if we decide that a building has, an increase in heritage import during the time like this permit's been sitting dormant? What happens over?
Through you, Madam Chair, that building has been designated since the mid-90s, and it has remained a designated building. It hasn't become, more designated. I mean, it has been protected the entire time. Its level of protection has stayed the same. So the process is still the same, and if the owner changes mind about what kind of that they didn't, the permit wasn't picked up in 2001, so if they want to do something else with that building, another application under the Heritage Act has to be applied for and received.
Okay, so they can't just go ahead now with that dormant permit.
It probably has. That's a building code. It probably has lapsed some way, but not from. And it actually, yeah.
Okay. So my last question is a little bit off of the vacant buildings, but there are some heritage buildings that are inhabited, but maybe to the minimum amount, or, rented at very low rates, and they are being allowed to fall apart as well, slowly. And I'm just wondering, is that something that we would consider in with this issue on heritage, if somebody is kind of, I don't want to say a slum landlord, but not, obviously not wanting to take care of the building, but using some tenants as placeholders until they can move on.
Through you, Madam Chair, there are under the Ontario Heritage Act, buildings are designated under Part 4 as individually designated buildings or as Part 5, and within the Ontario Heritage Act, in both those parts, there are provisions to have a heritage buildings property standards that would allow repairs to be made in situations such as you're addressing now, and that's something that Linda and her team will be looking at when they are analyzing the whole approach that they are going to be taking.
So if they're only on the Heritage Watch list, is that something as well that helps, or?
We have, if they're on the Heritage Reference List and there are issues, we have found, we use moral suasion, and someone will come in and say, we have to take these off, we have a property standards order, a building, whatever, and we say, well, could you please do it in such and such and so, to try to, if not restore, to keep it compatible with what's there, but that's just through the voluntary compliance on the part of the property owner. But we have been successful.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I know that we sent over the Winnipeg approach, which I believe maybe got more teeth than the London one. However, in this list is not all-inclusive.
No, it is not.
I can pick you out another half dozen. And it seems to me that when I did approach on a house that's at the corner of L'Église and Montreal Road, that I was given to understand that property standards have no authority in that area, exterior appearance. And now you're telling me you do, so I will email you that, Chief Anderson, because I think it needs to be looked at. I have had, if you will, we should add others in here. Some of them aren't boarded up even, but they've been vacant for a year anyway, minimum. So whether that should qualify them for this list or not, I think it should. And that means that if you're driving around Barhaven, there's been an empty house there since it stopped being a crack house or what are the other, they use those stuff. In any event, the other thing that you've put a limited property tax structure. Council did pass something on limiting commercial property tax vacancy reductions. A request to the province to eliminate that. It seems to me that we need to go a step farther in giving you more enforcement possibilities, not just on heritage, but on vacant properties in general, and whether there's any buildings on them in general. Somehow or other, we need to stimulate people not to just park them, whatever they've done, and that's just, to me, something that is part of the whole reason I raised the issue in December, why I'm not letting it go. The other thing I noticed, you said something about being on MAP. Well, you're well aware that councillors don't get on MAP anymore because we might violate somebody's privacy. I'm not going to leave that one go either. I think that's another one we need to get back to. Not here, by the way.
It's ridiculous. So
yeah, I mean,
I'm
Committee of
happy that you
Adjustment
brought it
sends
up.
us stuff back and says, well, you can get it on MAP. Well, no, I can't.
You know how ridiculous that sounds, even?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a fight for another day, but let's not drop it.
Anyway, I have all my little chestnuts. They're roasting nicely on the fire. We're going to feed them to you shortly. We had, for example, at 61 Queen Victoria, they were leaving a clear heritage house unheated for the winter until we got after them. didn't we? The house I think you're referring to is on Lansdowne?
No, it's on, no, it's not on Lansdowne. It's the one on, I believe it's Crescent? 5 Crescent Road?
Oh, Crescent Road, okay. Well, they happen, and we need to be vigilant if we're going to maintain the housing stock. That's part of our responsibility. And I think it's important for us to realize that when we take these items on, we've tended to be pretty successful. The one on Lansdowne is being rebuilt. The one on Montreal Road that's in this list, they've applied for a demolition permit because it's part of a larger piece of property, and they have gone through the proper processes. We'll see what happens to it. But I am concerned. I'm concerned that I can drive by and see vacant properties and nobody else sees them. It's enough rent. Probably at the end of the meeting, when we're done the topic itself, I have a couple things to re-raise.
On this topic?
No.
Okay. So that'll be another business. Member Quinn?
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question around the issue of non-compliance. You mentioned that you had, there was a property on, I think it was Wilbrod, where one of the walls is bowed, and you have requested that that be repaired. What are the, how long do you wait, I guess my question is, and what can you do to further enforce your request?
The one on Wilbrod is being dealt with by Building Code Services, so I won't answer on their behalf in terms of enforcement, what they would do. Generally, under property standards, we issue an order with a date of compliance, a reasonable date of compliance. The owner of the property has 14 days to appeal the order to the Property Standards Committee. And then after that, going through that process, when the compliance date is met, if there's been no action, then we have 2 routes that we can follow. Sometimes we take one route, sometimes the other, sometimes both. We can charge the owner of the property with failing to comply with the order and go through the courts, or we can we have the power to do the work ourselves and charge it back to the property owner. Depending on the magnitude of the work required, we have a tendency to go through the court process first before we do the work, just to ensure that the city and the ratepayers aren't going to be paying for those repairs. So we just make sure that we've closed all the doors, so to speak. On the one on Wilbrod, it is Building Code Services, so I would have to defer to Ms. Gregoire on that one.
It really was more, my question really was more in generally speaking. So when you say now that there are greater resources being directed in this area, enabling you and your team to investigate, do those resources also roll into following up on these issues of non-compliance?
We have dedicated 2 of our most experienced property standards officers over the next 18 months to deal specifically with this issue. They will be doing everything from A to Z on this issue. So they will be issuing the orders, they will be attending the appeal committee if necessary, they will be attending court if necessary, and they will be ensuring the work gets done at the end of the process.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, if that's all right. This goes back to the potential new mechanisms, the higher standards and maintenance that are specific to heritage-defining, character-defining elements in buildings that are designated under either Part 4 or 5. You mentioned the issue of keeping the heat on. Are there any other things, specific examples within that those recommendations, other than keeping the heat on, that will be in the report?
At this point, we haven't started to work on it. The City of London's Property Standards Bylaw has incorporated a fairly significant piece on heritage properties, which I think addresses it. So it would be absolutely requiring and very clearly requiring the owners of heritage properties to maintain those heritage elements, and having that all incorporated into the property standards bylaw. So it would bring the two pieces of legislation, marry them together better.
Okay. Is there any opportunity for this committee to see what goes before property standards, or, I'm sorry, the committee, what is the committee that it's going to on the April 18th? Thank you. Because this is the first presentation that we've had on this subject, and I was just wondering if there was an opportunity for us to see more detail.
When we were meeting, pre-meeting, the three of us before this, I had thrown out there the idea that perhaps this committee would like for us to come back, say, after, say, 3-month period and give you an update on where we are in this project. If it's the will of the chair, certainly available to do that. So by 3 months from now, we'll have some idea of the success in terms of getting compliance to the orders, where we are in terms of the new legislation, and it might be worthwhile for us to keep this committee in the loop on that if the chair so wishes.
What do others feel on the committee?
Yeah, it's a good idea. And also, just for your information, the report will go live the week before the committee, and certainly Joelle will send out the report to every member of the committee for your review. And then the way that works, if you want, any of us can come and register to speak as a delegation and speak on that day as well. So after you read the report. Also, in reading the report...
You're on that committee. Are you not on that committee?
No, I'm not.
Darn, how did they miss you?
I don't know, I got lucky. Also, for example, there's something that you feel, that any of us feel is missing, there's also an opportunity to ask one of the members of the... Are you still on that committee, Councillor Hobbs? Community and Protective Services? You just switched, right. But there are a lot of... Yeah, there's a lot of councillors that are on it, including Councillor Fleury, who has a lot of the properties in his area. So if there was something that you thought that should be beefed up, certainly putting together a motion, having that discussion with him or any of the other members on the committee. Councillor Holmes is also on it. She has a fair number of properties that are under heritage designation and on the reference list.
Okay, thanks.
Okay?
Thank you.
Vice Chair Podolsky?
Just as a follow-up on the new mechanisms that are being proposed, one, of course, is this request to Ontario to grant the city to limit property tax reductions, which I think might be a very effective technique. One of the other things that is sorely needed is a more community proactive effort to identify buildings that are vacant and or might be becoming vacant, so that we can be anticipating where there might be a problem of demolition by neglect. I think the point is to catch it early and to be alert to the processes of reurbanization where buildings which have a use then become vacant. And I'm thinking specifically of examples like the city's Bayview Works Yard building. This is something that the city owns, and are we actually taking the measures that are needed to set an example to private sector that buildings within our portfolio, which aren't designated yet under Part 4 or Part 5, but are slated to be? That's one example. Another example, again, in the industrial land use, you have the Booth Street complex owned by Enercan on Rochester and Booth, and there's a whole block of buildings there that are now vacant, and they are not designated under Part 5 or Part 4 under the Ontario Heritage Act, but they are now empty. And what initiative can the city take to approach Enercan to ensure that we don't have demolition by neglect there, for a cluster of buildings that are designated by the Federal Heritage Building Review Office, FBRO, as recognized. So I think that the ones that have come to our attention are the really visible ones, which are the small houses and maybe, Our Lady's School. But I think that it's important, as Councillor Hobbs said, she said the Heritage Watch List. We have the Heritage Reference List, but maybe the more appropriate term is the Heritage Watch List, and to seek help from Heritage Ottawa and others to scour the communities and to send in notices of buildings that are potential, candidates for demolition by neglect. And that's my suggestion, that the proactive process might also include, discussion between city staff and, say, the staff of school boards. School boards often, sell buildings that have heritage interest or that are not designated, and Our Lady's School was one of them. And the school board could very well have put an easement on the building that by selling it, you are obliged to restore it and and then maintain it. So I think that there's a number of techniques that this initiative by the mayor and Councillor Hume triggered, and which we are building on, that I think could be effective other initiatives to achieve the goal.
Any comment?
Well, I just certainly agree. The report on the 18th will be a strategy report, so we're going forward with an initial strategy and looking for an endorsement. Once we get into doing the various amendments to the bylaws, we will be consulting with heritage groups on the heritage components of it. So no doubt we'll be back to this committee with the amendments that we're proposing. Interesting, since we had within our own branch, we had a fairly significant list of vacant derelict buildings, but once the story was out into the media, within a week's time, our list had doubled. So there are people out there that are keeping us in the loop in terms of vacant buildings. Our officers are out into areas of the city every single day. We will be proactive in identifying those buildings. As long as they're not derelict, as long as they have windows and doors and they're weather tight, we're satisfied with that for the time being. It's when they start to deteriorate to the point where there's no return for them that we don't want buildings to get to that point. Whether they're heritage or not, we don't want to see buildings in the city at that level of dereliction.
Good. Member Smallwood?
Thank you. I think I know the answer to this question, but I just wanted to confirm. I know that in some of the buildings, Booth Board being one of them that I was in, the building's considered a hazardous site now because of pigeon and raccoon droppings. And I just wondered, there are some buildings that still are boarded up, but raccoons are tunneling underneath, getting inside, and then the droppings create a hazardous situation. Is that something you can currently take action on, or is that something you need additional power specifically to say that you have, that once animals have taken over the building, you can take action? Thank you.
In terms of access into the buildings, we have limited authority to go into buildings that are considered to be dwellings, whether there's actually people living in them or not. What we are going to focus on at the moment on those buildings is the exterior of them. If we change the regulations through amendments to the bylaw that would require us to have access into the buildings, it's not impossible. We would require a warrant, but we could go in. We've recently dealt with a building outside the center core that had significant animal infiltration into the building, even though somebody was still living in that building. And we have dealt with it. We are dealing with it. We rely on experts to assist us with that. So it's part of what we do. The biggest issue is getting access to inside of what is considered to be a dwelling.
Councillor Hobbs first.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So just in terms of 7 Bayview and that the Vice Chair brought up, that is city building, and I guess originally that was slated for demolition, and then thanks to work from the community and so on, we have saved that building, and it is on the heritage reference list, and I guess will be made heritage throughout this process. But the actions that were taken there to protect that building, and the heat is on, and there is a caretaker that's around there. But the actions that were taken to prevent the animals, and specifically the birds, from getting in on the roof, is that something that you would consider as part of? Like if there's a new bylaw, because I think there's some kind of wiring or something on the roof that stops the birds from getting in, and I think some birds are worse than others, the pigeons versus gulls. But is it, would you be able to get that specific, because that is what created a lot of the problems in the 7 Bayview building. You couldn't actually enter because of the bird mess.
We'll certainly look at that. Right now, boarding up requires that it boarded up against the elements. I don't have the definition of elements in front of me and whether or not it includes animals, but certainly I agree with you that certainly animals inside of a building can cause significant damage. So we will be looking at that. I appreciate your giving me that thought, so I think we need to look at that.
Vice Chair Podolsky.
I'd just like to follow up on Councillor Hobbs' point about the boarding up aspect and the securing of buildings that have heritage interest. And in particular, it is very difficult to observe the condition of a roof, a flat roof. And I'm going to give you an example, and that is the École Gig on Murray Street. Gig was owned by the school board and was closed and kept vacant for 15 years between the early 1980s and mid-1995. And at that time, the City of Ottawa did not feel that the property standards bylaw permitted it to inspect the building because it was a non-residential building. It was a vacant school. And the dilemma was that over that period of 15 years, there were some leaks in the flat roof. There were openings in the flat roof. The pigeons got in, and the water penetrated the roof. And over the years, there was a cascading waterfall and then ice that formed, and the entire interior of the school collapsed. And this was notwithstanding, I was involved as the heritage architect for some groups that were trying to purchase the school. And this little case study is an example that I want to bring forward about how the need to inspect really includes the need to look at flat roofs as well. In the end, the property was purchased by Centre de Jeux Gig, a non-profit group, but the cost of the renovation, which was for a community center and condos, escalated to between $250,000 and $500,000 extra because the school board did not put a few small patches on the roof, which could have been a few $1,000s. So that's the kind of escalating problem that we have. And I visited the Booth board mill, and there are trees growing out of the roof. And I don't know whether whether trees are a natural element or whether it's just water, snow, ice, and wind, but certainly animals and trees that affect the integrity of the structure should be considered one and the same thing, because the effect is not dissimilar. So just as a way of adding to the scope of the intent of the bylaw and the inspection techniques, I I think you should consider what Councillor Hobbs suggested. Thank you.
So I guess that's a great example, and I'm sure that it's not the only one. So how do we, what can you do to seek the authority that you would need in this regard?
Actually, what we currently can do, and the issue is that we haven't sufficiently married up the heritage attributes with our property standards bylaw, but on a normal building with no heritage attributes, if we believe that the roof is leaking, if there are signs that it's in disrepair, we can require the owner of the property to produce a report to show that the roof is sound. If the property owner does not do that, so this is by way of order, then the city will hire somebody to undertake that study and do the necessary repairs, and that will all be charged back to the property owner through his tax roll. So if we get, now some of the, some of the buildings that currently exist in the city that have fallen into dereliction, we will do our best. If nothing else, it is our hope that by requiring works to be done on these buildings, it may encourage some of the owners to move forward with some of the plans that they might have had in the past and not followed up as quickly with as we would hope they would. But certainly going forward, we're hoping to create a bylaw strong enough so that similar things cannot happen to other buildings in the city of Ottawa. But even if we don't have ready access into the inside of a building, it doesn't mean that we can't require the owner of that building to prove something to us if we have reason to believe that there is a problem, such as the roof leaking.
But you wouldn't have reason to believe is what I think the point that Vice Chair was raising, because it's a flat roof, so it's not like if you have a pitched roof and you can obviously see a hole in it, or the chimney leaning away from it, or well, it's very easy to see that if you're looking. But in the case of a flat roof, and we have many examples of those around the city, you wouldn't see it. So how about this? What if you were to, you talked about an annual fee. I don't know what that amount that you're considering is, but I would imagine it would be different for institutional or commercial or residential. But what kind of amounts are we talking about?
The vacant building permits. I believe in the city of Winnipeg, they started at $1,000 for the first year, or $2,000 for the first year, and I believe they increase every year up to $1,500. No, they start at $2,000 and go up. Oh, so it's $2,000. Then the next year it's $2,000 plus another amount. So every year that the building is left vacant, there's an increased permit fee.
Are you sure that that amount is going to cost recover the extra services that you're going to have your staff do? Because it's a very big project. I mean, if you take the presentation to the max and you have those two people, for example, their salaries are probably, they're senior people, I'm sure. Is that going to be sufficient to be recovering that? Because I think that that's what we would want to see. We'd want to see an investment that's going to, so that you're able to adequately visit, protect, follow up. I mean, once you start talking court cases and all that kind of stuff, I mean, that's a lot of time that you're not on the road, you're, doing things other than what I think what we would like you to be doing. So is that fee cost recoverable?
We'll certainly be looking at those permit fees. I think the other thing to remember is that presently these buildings are causing a lot of work for us, for bylaw services, for fire, for police, for the needle hunter through Ottawa Public Health. And those costs we're not recovering them adequately. Our hope is that through bringing these buildings up to a secure standard, a good standard, we'll have less need of that enforcement activity. But we'll certainly be looking for the permits to cover, to help us assist with compensating for our increased enforcement in that area, for sure.
So would it be possible if, for example, when the owner comes in to pay for the permit or on an annual basis or on a biannual basis, that they have some kind of a structural checklist that is signed by someone of authority that says, yes, there's no tree growing out at the top of it, no, there's no birds and raccoons that are, that are affecting impacting the integrity of the building. Is that possible legally, or is that something that right you would have to seek?
We'd have to consult with legal services on where we could go with that. The big, if I may use the term, the big stick with the Winnipeg bylaw is that eventually, at the end of the process of the permits, the municipality can actually take possession of the property. Currently, in Ontario, we don't have that legal right. We've got legal services looking into all of that for us as well. So that's just one of the tools that we're pursuing. It seems like a fairly good bylaw that addresses some of the issues we need to address. We will be looking for ways to cost recover for this, and this is certainly one of the mechanisms, but we'll have to consult with legal services on how far we can go and what we can do with that.
Well, I think that there's it's a huge stick that Winnipeg has if they have the right to do that, and we don't have that right. So therefore, that changes my opinion of the annual cost for a permit. I think that if we have I don't think it's unreasonable, and I'd like you to follow up with legal and see whether we can do it. I think that there should be some kind of an inspection that goes along with the permit. And I think that it doesn't, maybe it's something that can be further developed, but at the very least, there should be something that speaks to the structural integrity of the space in any of these buildings. And if you don't have that piece of paper, therefore you don't get your permit, and then we're going in a different fashion. We've got a lot of catch-up to do, and certainly I was disappointed, I think, that every single one of these places that you mentioned, the social impact of the needle pickup. I mean, they seem to be going, they are going hand in hand. So I'm wondering why it took us this long to take action. I mean, I think that we've heard from Linda Hoad, I see in the audience, over the years has talked about her own community and people in Vanier, I mean, in their communities that have come before various committees of council over the last 12 years at least, or 13 years, and have talked just about that. And so, I mean, it's good that we're doing it now, but, man, it's like a wake-up call that the alarm should have gone off a long time ago. So I would like my takeaway would be certainly look at those fees, see if they are rigorous enough, high enough to do what you need to do, because there's going to be a lot of upfront work that you're going to have to do. I mean, it's going to take at least a couple of years before I think that you're going to have a really good handle on it, especially with just two people. And I don't think that it's unreasonable to also consider the place that got the rezoning. As we know, there's a time frame that people have to reapply, or they have to have their plan of subdivision after they do their zoning, or there's rules to do under the Planning Act that I think that we could use with this as well. So if somebody comes in like the one from 2001 and it's zoned for 10 stories, well, I think that there has to be a refresher or something. That also would bring to the attention, attention of yourselves, and certainly this committee on the heritage issues. And I think that Mr. Mark probably would know whether we were able to do that or not, quite easily. But I think that would add more teeth to it. Anybody have any comments on that? Because this is our opportunity for Ms. Anderson and her team to take away our comments. Like to see it? Yeah, Member Smallwood?
I really want to agree with what you said. I think it's so important that to get the permit to leave it vacant, that there be some sort of inspection, that where somebody has signed off saying they've been inside and there isn't water cascading through it. You mentioned about a wake-up call. In Councillor Clark's ward, there was a building 245 Crichton Street, owned by the City of Ottawa, and that building was demolished simply because of a roof leak. It was owned by the city, the building was not properly inspected, there was no heat kept in it, water leaked through the roof, it was a simple repair that might have cost a couple of $1,000s, and as a result of failure to repair that building had to be demolished. And it's shocking to see that resources get demolished for those reasons. So I strongly agree with your suggestion.
Do you agree? Anybody have any other comments, questions, suggestions? Yes. Vice Chair Podolsky?
The suggestion that I have is that the momentum that has been created, in the last month or so to address the issue of demolition by neglect could also, I think, maybe in the near future be supplemented by maybe just a one-day symposium inviting community groups, building owners of certain subject buildings to have an informal symposium on the issue and to seek ideas from the community, and also to hear from particular building owners, say like Domtar, about what their intentions are for their properties on Shorteo Island. And so that might be something that could be by invitation as part of the scope of this new initiative.
Any comments? You don't have to if you don't have comments. I'm not asking you to make it up as you go along.
I don't have any comments. I'm sure that all the property owners of negligent or derelict buildings would be happy to spend a day with all of us.
No, but it'd be interesting to see of the heritage ones, because that's what we're talking about. But and the bigger picture of all of them, are there owners of large numbers of them? And maybe that's something that would be low-hanging fruit. Bring them in, have that discussion. Well, we're not going to mention the one that we have in front of us at court. That's one. But are there other ones like that where they own several of these? And I think that might be an opportunity. Just again, I'm not looking for an answer from you, but if there is, that would be a suggestion that they be brought in and read the new Riot Act, so that there's no misunderstanding. But I really think that as far as you've gone, if that's as far as you can go, it's not far enough. And I think that all of us on the committee would agree with that. So if there is more that can be done, then we would hope that you would do that. Okay? Thank you very much. Thank you for coming today. Look forward to seeing the whole report. And again, Joelle, you will be sending it to us as soon as it's available. Okay, thank you. So that's... we're just on to any notices of motions. I don't think we have to receive it. It was just a presentation. Any inquiries? Well, we do have some other business. Yeah, Councillor Clark.
Well, at our last meeting, we talked about getting the work plan put forward on Heritage, which included the updating and modernizing, if you will, of the heritage conservation districts, and I am still looking for it, so I'm just going to keep reminding you every meeting. Can you
repeat that? Did you hear?
I did hear that it's a departmental work plan, it's approved by council, and it goes to council, and I referred your question to the person who prepares that report for planning and growth management. So that is that has been.
Yeah, I think we'd like to see where this is going and what sort of timelines are there and things like that. Because when we still have them categorized as Category 4, which is a meaningless category, when the Briarcliff one and the new one doesn't do that. Clearly, it's heritage value or it isn't. It seems to me to be a lot cleaner, and I think that the New Edinburgh one needs refurbishing, the Rockcliffe Park one needs refurbishing, the Lower Town. Now, I don't necessarily know if that's your work plan or is it departmental work plan or whose it is, but I'd like to see what it is so we know where it's headed.
As part of regular council's business, I understand that work plans are circulated to all councillors when in the term of council work plan. So I think that, and I know that planning and growth management, some revisions are coming up in a report format to planning committee. I think it might be also on the April 18th, but there is someone within planning and growth management who draws up those work plans and gets them in front of committee and council and circulates them to committee and council, so that then you can. And I have told that person, so you can ask them for it.
If you like a question, you don't have to take personal responsibility. I understand.
Joelle will speak to the committee coordinator for planning and get that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I don't think it's the 18th. 18th is CPCS.
Yes, sorry, I was told that the departmental work plan will be in the next 6 weeks. I can't remember the date.
That's all.
Thank you.
I'm
That's
gonna
it?
continue to rant.
You're good at it, too. Okay, and so I just wanted to remind everybody that Heritage Ottawa has a special lecture and book launch. Werner Ernst Noffke, Ottawa's architect. It's on April the 17th. It's a lecture by architectural historian Shannon Ricketts at the Ottawa Public Library Auditorium. Reception at 6 and lecture at 7. And we've asked that we have this information in here. It's an opportunity where we can showcase what's happening in the city, and hopefully people that are reading their reports, if they are, I mean, there's lots of people interested in heritage, of course, will take note and maybe attend. So thank you, everybody. We're adjourned. Thank you.
I said, I hope you guys will be at the lecture. It's free. It's free.
It's free. That's the value you're going to get out of it. Oops.
No, that's not true.